Let me tell you about the winter that Cynthia Fairbanks finally bit off more than she could chew, and how a bright orange snowcat sitting in my neighbor Dave's driveway became the single most important vehicle in the history of our little subdivision. It started on the coldest Tuesday in February that any of us could remember. We're talking 17 below zero with the wind chill, the kind of cold that makes your nose hairs freeze the second you step outside, and your car door handle feels like grabbing onto a piece of dry ice. The news was calling it the worst cold snap in 30 years. Schools were closed. Half the roads in the county were sheets of pure glassy ice. The county plow trucks had been running nonstop for 4 days, and they still couldn't keep up. Our subdivision, Pinecrest Estates, sits about 3 miles off the main highway down a 2-lane road that the county treats like a distant afterthought even during normal winters. During this particular polar vortex event, that road was essentially impassable for a regular car. I'm Neil Marshall, and I've lived in Pinecrest Estates for going on 9 years now. It's a nice neighborhood, genuinely, or at least it would be if it weren't for the HOA, and more specifically, if it weren't for Cynthia Fairbanks. Cynthia is the kind of HOA board member who woke up one morning and decided that having a little bit of authority over 112 homes meant she was basically a government unto herself. She's mid-50s, always in a puffy down coat that looks like she's wearing a marshmallow, drives a spotless white Lexus SUV, and has never once in the 9 years I've lived here done a single thing that actually benefited the community rather than herself or her personal crusade against anything she found aesthetically offensive. She's been on the HOA board for 6 years running, partly because she runs unopposed every single time after somehow convincing the 2 or 3 people who tried to challenge her that it wasn't worth the effort. She's chairman of the Violations Committee, which is a position that, in the wrong hands, is basically a license to make your neighbors miserable, and she has used that license with extraordinary enthusiasm. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about Dave Kowalski first. Dave lives 2 houses down from me, on the corner lot. He's a big, cheerful guy in his early 50s, former heavy equipment operator, spent 20 years working construction and road crews before he took a buyout and semi-retired. He and his wife Linda have lived in Pinecrest Estates longer than almost anyone, over 15 years. Dave is the kind of neighbor everybody wants. When a tree falls on your fence during a storm, Dave is already walking over with a chainsaw before you've finished your first cup of coffee. When old Mrs. Patterson's furnace quit during a cold snap 2 years ago, Dave was the one who ran space heaters over to her house and stayed until the repair guy arrived, just to make sure she was okay. He knows how to fix just about everything. He has more tools than most hardware stores, and he genuinely enjoys helping people. If you've ever wondered why some neighborhoods feel like real communities and others feel like strangers living next to each other, the answer is usually that the Dave Kowalski type either exists in that neighborhood or doesn't. Now, Dave had owned the Snowcat for about 3 years. It wasn't some enormous military surplus monster, though I'll admit it was impressive. It was a Thiocal Imp, which is a compact tracked vehicle about the size of a large pickup truck, maybe a bit taller. It seated 4 people, had a small plow blade on the front, and Dave had bought it specifically because of our road situation. After the winter of 2 years ago, when our street was completely inaccessible for 11 days straight, and one of our neighbors had a medical emergency that nearly became a tragedy because the ambulance couldn't get through, Dave had decided enough was enough. He bought the Snowcat, restored it, kept it maintained, and every serious winter storm, he'd fire it up and make passes up and down our street and through the neighborhood. He didn't charge anybody a cent. He just did it because he was Dave, and Dave believed in taking care of his community. The thing was a genuine hero machine. When we got hammered with 16 inches of snow 2 winters ago, Dave was the reason the mail lady could get through, the reason the grocery delivery van didn't get stuck, and the reason that same neighbor who'd had the medical scare could actually get out and make it to a doctor's appointment. Everyone in Pinecrest Estates knew about the Snowcat, and basically everyone loved it. The orange paint and the rumbling tracks and the slow, steady progress it made down the street had become a kind of winter symbol for us, like a big, cheerful promise that no matter how bad it got out there, Dave had us covered. Cynthia, naturally, hated it. She'd been looking for an angle on that Snowcat since Dave first brought it home. She tried to claim it was a commercial vehicle because it had the word Thiokol printed on the side, and Dave had to explain to her patiently that Thiokol was simply the manufacturer's name, and the vehicle was entirely for personal use. She tried to claim it was being used for commercial snow removal services, and that Dave needed a business license, and Dave had to point out that he never charged anyone a single dollar. She tried to claim the tracks would damage the road surface, and Dave had to remind her that the road was a county road and not HOA property, and the county had actually thanked him in writing for his assistance. Every angle she tried, Dave deflected with facts, patience, and good humor, and every time she walked away frustrated. But this particular February, with the worst cold snap in 30 years bearing down on us and the roads completely iced over, Dave had parked the Snowcat in his driveway in preparation for doing a full pass of the neighborhood. It was sitting there, fully prepped, orange and ready, a genuine lifeline for a neighborhood that was essentially cut off from the outside world. And that's when Cynthia chose to act. I heard about it first from Linda, Dave's wife, who called me on the phone that Tuesday morning sounding somewhere between furious and disbelieving. Cynthia had apparently walked over to their house in her marshmallow coat, stood at the end of their driveway in about 8 inches of fresh snow, and delivered a formal verbal notice that the Snowcat constituted an oversized vehicle violation under Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the Pinecrest Estates HOA Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. She had even brought a laminated card with the rule printed on it, which, if nothing else, you had to almost admire for the sheer commitment to bureaucratic theater. The rule, as Dave later read it to me over the phone, stated that no vehicle exceeding the standard dimensions of a full-size pickup truck should be stored or parked in a visible driveway area for more than 48 hours without HOA board approval. The Snowcat, according to Cynthia's measurements, which she had apparently conducted herself with a tape measure she'd brought along, was 8 inches taller than a standard full-size pickup truck and therefore in violation. 8 inches. During a once-in-a-generation polar vortex, with roads that were physically impassable to regular vehicles. I pulled on my heaviest coat and my insulated boots and walked over to Dave's house because some conversations need to happen in person. Dave met me at the door looking like a man who had decided to be calm about something infuriating, which is a very specific expression that people with genuine self-control get to wear and the rest of us just envy. He had the CCR document out on his kitchen table and was reading through it with a highlighter. Linda was making coffee and looking like she was the one who actually wanted to fight someone. We read through Section 7 together. And here's the thing, Cynthia wasn't entirely wrong about the rule existing. The rule did say what she said it said. But Dave, who had been reading the whole document rather than just the one paragraph Cynthia had cherry-picked, found something interesting about 4 pages further in. Section 14, Paragraph 8, Emergency Use Exception. In the event of declared whether emergencies or conditions presenting a danger to community safety, homeowners may maintain necessary equipment on their properties without standard dimensional or aesthetic restrictions, provided the equipment is being actively used for community safety purposes and is not operated for commercial gain. Dave read it out loud twice. I read it once myself just to make sure. It was right there in plain black and white, buried in the back half of a document that Cynthia had presumably assumed nobody would ever read all the way through. The county had issued an emergency weather declaration 2 days prior. Dave was using the Snowcat for community safety purposes. He was not charging anyone. Every single element of the exception applied perfectly, like a key cut to fit the exact lock Cynthia had tried to use against him. Dave picked up his phone and called Cynthia directly. I sat across the kitchen table and watched his face as he delivered the information. He was pleasant about it. He read her the section number and paragraph. He explained how the emergency declaration applied, and he told her he would be proceeding with his planned snow clearance run as soon as the temperature came up a degree or two, because even the Snowcat had trouble with black ice at 17 below. He thanked her for her concern and ended the call. There was a pause of maybe 15 seconds after he set the phone down. Then his phone rang again. Cynthia, calling back. This time the pleasant conversation was replaced by a somewhat less pleasant one. I could hear her voice through the phone from across the table, not quite the words, but the tone. She was telling Dave that she did not accept his interpretation of Section 14, that she was the violations committee chair and her determination was final, and that he needed to move the Snowcat into his garage or off the property within 24 hours, or she would be filing a formal violation notice and pursuing fines. Dave said, politely but firmly, that she was welcome to pursue whatever process she believed was appropriate, that he would be documenting his position in writing, and that he looked forward to the board reviewing the matter fully. Then he ended that call too. He put the phone down and looked at me. "She's really going to do it," Linda said from over by the coffee maker. It wasn't quite a question. "Yep," Dave said. "Then we'd better be ready," I said. "Here's the thing about living in a neighborhood for 9 years. You know people. You know who has been keeping notes, you know who has a good memory for dates and conversations, and you know who has been quietly building a case file because they've been waiting for exactly this moment." I'm not saying I had a folder on my laptop labeled Cynthia Fairbanks HOA violations, but I am saying that if such a folder existed, it would have been very organized and very detailed. I went home and started making calls. The first call was to my neighbor Greg Acaffer, who lived directly across from the HOA's little clubhouse building and had installed a security camera system about a year and a half ago after someone had scratched his car in the common parking area. Greg's cameras covered the clubhouse entrance, the parking area, and a good chunk of the street in front of his house. He was an IT professional and had cloud backups of everything rolling back about 18 months. I told him what was happening and asked if he'd been keeping up with his footage. He said yes, and that he thought there might be some interesting things in there related to Cynthia, and that he'd been wondering when someone was going to ask about it. The second call was to Barbara Chen, who had been on the HOA board 2 years ago before Cynthia had essentially maneuvered her out through what Barbara described as a sustained campaign of procedural harassment. Barbara had resigned rather than deal with it anymore, but she'd kept records of everything from her time on the board, including emails, minutes, and financial documents, because she'd had the foresight to sense that it would matter eventually. The third call was to the property management company that the HOA technically contracted with for administrative services. The management company was named Clear Path Property Management, and they had a guy named Phil Donovan who handled our account. Phil was strictly professional and not particularly on anyone's side, but he was thorough, and he cared about things being done by the book. And I knew he'd been quietly frustrated with Cynthia for some time, because she had a habit of making decisions without going through the proper channels, and then trying to get the management company to validate them after the fact. I explained the situation to Phil. He was quiet for a moment, and then said he would need to review the relevant sections himself, but that his preliminary read was that the emergency exception clause sounded applicable, and that any enforcement action during an active weather emergency declaration would need to be reviewed by the full board rather than the violations chair alone. That was important. That meant Cynthia couldn't just do this unilaterally. By the time I finished my calls, it was early afternoon, and the temperature had actually dropped another 3 degrees. The wind was absolutely savage. I looked out my front window and could see Dave's Snowcat sitting bright orange in his driveway, completely unbothered by Cynthia or the weather, and I felt a small warm feeling in my chest that I identified as the beginning of a plan coming together. The formal violation notice arrived at Dave's door the next morning, hand-delivered by Cynthia herself, which was already a procedural problem because violation notices were supposed to go through Clear Path. It was a 2-page document citing Section 7, Paragraph 3, asserting that the Snowcat was an oversized vehicle in violation of community standards, demanding its removal or storage within 72 hours, and threatening daily fines of $50 per day after that deadline. It was signed by Cynthia Fairbanks, Violations Committee Chair, with an impressive-looking official seal that Dave said he'd never seen used on any other HOA document before. Dave photographed it front and back, sent me a copy, sent a copy to Phil at Clear Path, and then sat down and wrote his formal written response. He cited Section 14, Paragraph 8, attached a copy of the county's weather emergency declaration, and requested that the matter be placed on the agenda for a full board meeting as required by the HOA's own procedural rules for contested violation notices. He sent it via certified mail and also emailed it to every board member individually, using the contact list from the HOA's own website. That afternoon, Dave fired up the Snowcat and did his run. I'm going to tell you, watching that orange machine roll slowly down our street in the middle of the worst cold snap in 30 years, with about 15 of our neighbors standing in their doorways or on their porches watching, and most of them giving Dave a wave or a thumbs up, was one of the better moments I've experienced as a resident of Pinecrest Estates. The tracks bit into the packed snow and ice, and the little plow blade pushed a neat berm to either side, and for the first time in 4 days our street actually looked passable. 2 houses down from me, old Mrs. Patterson came outside in her coat and gloves and waved both arms above her head at Dave, and he gave her a cheerful honk from the Snowcat's horn, which turned out to be hilariously loud. Cynthia watched from her front window. I know because I happened to be outside shoveling my walk at the time, and I could see her standing there with what I can only describe as an expression of concentrated displeasure, the kind of face that a person makes when something they wanted to fail is succeeding in front of their eyes. The next 48 hours were a flurry of activity that had nothing to do with the snow. Dave got a response from Phil at Clear Path confirming that his request for a full board review was procedurally valid, and that the Violations Committee Chair did not have unilateral authority to assess daily fines on a contested notice. That was a significant development because it meant that as long as the dispute was formally contested and pending board review, the fine clock couldn't run. Cynthia apparently called Phil and argued about this at some length, and Phil apparently told her the same thing 3 times without changing his answer, which I imagine gave him a certain quiet satisfaction. Greg Ockhaffer came over to my house with his laptop and showed me what he'd found in his security footage. And here, I want to be clear, what Greg showed me was not some minor procedural irregularity. It was not a technicality or an ambiguous situation that could be interpreted multiple ways. What Greg's camera had captured on 4 separate occasions over the past 14 months was Cynthia Fairbanks entering the HOA clubhouse with what appeared to be contractors, spending varying amounts of time inside and leaving. The timestamps were precise. The contractors had visible logos on their jackets. In 2 of the clips, Cynthia could be seen carrying what looked like boxes of materials into the clubhouse, and in one of the later clips, a van with a painting company's logo was clearly visible parked outside for the better part of a day. None of this would necessarily be damning on its own. The HOA did maintenance on the clubhouse. That was normal. except that Barbara Chen, when I called her and described the dates, pulled out her records from her time on the board and confirmed something very interesting. She had been on the board during 2 of those 4 occasions. There had been no discussion at any board meeting of clubhouse renovation work during either of those periods. There had been no approved budget line for renovation or painting work. And the HOA's financial statements, which were supposed to be distributed to all homeowners annually, but which Cynthia had been managing with what Barbara described as a conspicuous lack of transparency, showed no payments to any of the vendors whose logos Greg had captured on camera. Barbara's voice went very quiet and very precise when she told me this, the way a person's voice gets when they've suspected something for a long time and have just had it confirmed. She said she had emails from her time on the board in which she'd asked Cynthia directly about certain unaccounted expenditures and been told they were administrative costs that fell within the chair's discretionary authority. She'd been skeptical but hadn't been able to prove anything at the time, and the effort to investigate further had been one of the things that had made her tenure on the board miserable enough that she'd eventually resigned. I sat with this information for a day before deciding what to do with it. I want to be accurate about my timeline here, because the events moved fast, and it matters that I tell it right. On the 4th day after the initial Snowcat confrontation, Cynthia apparently decided that waiting for the board review process was not to her taste and escalated. She sent a letter, again on what appeared to be official HOA letterhead, to Dave's mortgage company. The letter stated that Dave Kowalski was in violation of his HOA covenants, and that the violation had the potential to affect his property value and his standing as a homeowner in good standing, and it implied that this was relevant to his mortgage in some way. It was vague enough that it wasn't obviously making a false claim, but it was specific enough that a mortgage company taking it seriously might flag Dave's account. This was a different level of thing. Sending a letter to a homeowner's mortgage company based on a disputed violation that hadn't even been reviewed by the full board yet, and doing it in a way clearly designed to cause financial anxiety for the homeowner. This was not a gray area anymore. This was Cynthia using the HOA's authority as a tool to inflict deliberate financial harm on a neighbor who had done nothing wrong. I called my friend Tom Reeves, who is an attorney. Not an HOA attorney specifically, but a real estate attorney who had dealt with enough HOA disputes to have strong opinions about them. I described the whole situation to Tom, including the escalation to the mortgage company, and asked him to tell me where we stood. Tom was quiet for a moment and then said something along the lines of, "The mortgage company letter is a problem for her. If she misrepresented the status of the violation to a financial institution, that's potentially actionable. And if you've got footage suggesting financial mismanagement of HOA funds, that's a separate matter entirely, and it needs to go to the right people." I asked him who the right people were. He said the county district attorney's office for the financial stuff, and that the mortgage company letter might support a claim under state consumer protection laws, and that at minimum, we should be talking to the HOA's liability insurance carrier, because an individual board member acting outside her authority and causing financial harm to a homeowner was exactly the kind of thing HOA board member insurance existed to cover, and that the insurer would want to know about it. Dave, when I told him all of this, was angry in a very quiet and focused way, not the explosive kind of angry that makes you do impulsive things. The kind that makes you careful and methodical and very certain about what you're going to do next. He called his mortgage company directly that same afternoon, explained the situation, told them the violation was disputed and pending board review, and provided them with the full text of Section 14, Paragraph 8 and the county's weather emergency declaration. The mortgage company representative told him they had received the letter, that it had been flagged but not acted upon, and that his explanation was being noted in his account file. They also interestingly, asked Dave if he wanted to file a complaint about the content of the letter, and he said yes. Meanwhile, the weather remained absolutely brutal. We had another 8 inches fall over 2 nights, and the temperature didn't climb above single digits for almost a week. Dave did 2 more Snowcat runs during this period, once with me riding along because honestly it was too cold to care about looking ridiculous, sitting up there in that little orange cab while the tracks crushed through the packed snow and ice like it was nothing. On the second run, we came across a UPS truck that had slid off the road about 100 yards from the subdivision entrance and was sitting at an awkward angle with its rear wheels on an ice sheet. Dave hitched a tow strap to it and pulled it back onto the road in about 4 minutes flat. The driver shook Dave's hand and said he was going to write a letter to someone. He wasn't sure who, but someone who needed to know that this guy existed. Back in the neighborhood, things were coming to a head. I had organized a meeting at my house, which wasn't officially anything, just neighbors having coffee, but which ended up being attended by 23 people, which is nearly a quarter of the households in Pinecrest Estates. I went over what we knew. I showed them the relevant sections of the CCR document. Greg showed his security footage on my laptop. Barbara Chen was there and walked everyone through the financial inconsistencies she'd observed. Tom Reeves, who had agreed to attend as a personal favor and was clear that he wasn't representing anyone formally at this point, explained what the legal implications might be. The room was very quiet when Barbara finished talking about the finances, the kind of quiet where you can feel people adjusting their understanding of a situation. A lot of these people had written their HOA dues checks for 6 years and assumed the money was being spent on community maintenance, snow removal services that mostly didn't show up during storms anyway, the clubhouse upkeep, and the other line items that appeared in the annual budget. The idea that a portion of that money might have been redirected to things that benefited Cynthia personally, and specifically was something that landed hard. Old Mrs. Patterson, who I hadn't expected to make the walk down to my house in the cold, was there sitting in my best armchair with a cup of tea, and she said something I thought was exactly right. She said she'd been writing those dues checks for 15 years and she had always assumed there was someone trustworthy in charge, and that she supposed she'd trusted too easily, but that what mattered now was doing something about it rather than feeling bad about not catching it sooner. There was a general murmur of agreement. We voted, informally, to do 3 things. First, to submit a formal petition requesting a special board meeting to address the Snowcat violation and the general question of how violation notices were being issued, signed by enough homeowners to trigger the mandatory meeting provision in the CCR, which required a meeting if 15% of homeowners requested one. We had 23 people in my house and could easily get more signatures. Second, to submit a formal written request to clear path for a full financial audit of the HOA accounts for the past 3 years, which homeowners were entitled to request under state law. Third, to file a complaint with the county DA's office regarding the potential financial irregularities, not as a criminal accusation, but as an inquiry requesting an investigation. Tom helped us draft all 3 documents that evening, and by the next morning we had 41 signatures on the petition, more than a third of the neighborhood. Philip Clear Path received the financial audit request and said he would initiate the process immediately, and he sounded relieved about it in a way that told me he had his own concerns that he hadn't been positioned to act on without homeowner pressure. The formal complaint to the DA's office was submitted on a Friday afternoon. I want to be honest that I didn't expect anything dramatic to come of it quickly. DA offices have a lot on their plates, and a potential financial dispute in an HOA is not exactly the kind of thing that gets rush treatment. What I did expect was that submitting it would create an official record, and that the existence of that record would change the calculus for Cynthia in ways that might slow her down. What I didn't anticipate was that the county DA's office would turn out to have a relatively fresh financial crimes investigator named Sandra Patel, who had been looking for a while for a case that would help her office establish their capacity in a type of fraud that was, as she would later explain to a newspaper, genuinely common and genuinely under-investigated. HOA financial fraud by board members, in case you weren't aware, is something that happens with surprising regularity in communities across the country, and it very rarely gets prosecuted because the amounts involved aren't large enough for the FBI, and local law enforcement often treats it as a civil matter. But it is real fraud. It's people in positions of trust using that trust to steal from their neighbors, and it matters. Sandra reached out to Phil at Clear Path within a week of our complaint being filed, before the audit had even formally started, and requested access to the financial records directly. Phil cooperated fully and promptly. He had his own obligations to his client community and to his professional ethics, and he wasn't going to stand between an investigator and documentation of potential fraud. In the meantime, the special board meeting was scheduled. Cynthia, when she got the petition, apparently tried to find a procedural reason to reject it, but Phil told her clearly that a petition with 41 valid homeowner signatures met the threshold for a mandatory special meeting under the CCR, and that refusing to schedule it would put the board in violation of its own governing documents. The meeting was set for a Thursday evening 2 weeks out, in the HOA clubhouse. The temperature had climbed back up to something survivable by then, still well below freezing but no longer the kind of cold that makes you wonder whether you're in Minnesota or the surface of Mars. The roads were clear. Dave's Snowcat was still in his driveway, still orange, still perfectly calm about the whole situation. 4 days before the special meeting, Cynthia made what I can only describe as a tactical error of significant proportions. She sent a group email to the entire neighborhood, using the HOA's community email list, arguing her case regarding the Snowcat violation. This was, by itself, not particularly unusual. People send emails. But in her email she made 2 statements that turned out to be measurably and provably false. The first was that Dave had never sought board approval for the Snowcat and had simply assumed he could park it wherever he pleased. This was false because Dave had in fact raised the matter at an HOA meeting 2 years earlier, before the first winter he'd used it, and Barbara Chen confirmed she remembered the discussion and that it had been recorded in the meeting minutes, which Phil had on file. The second and more significant was that the emergency use exception in Section 14 had been amended out of the CCR document at a board meeting 18 months ago, and that the version of the document Dave was citing was outdated. She even referenced a specific meeting date for this supposed amendment. Dave pulled up the HOA website immediately and checked the posted version of the CCR. It still had Section 14, Paragraph 8. He called Phil. Phil confirmed that no amendment to Section 14 had ever been recorded, filed with the county as required by law for CCR amendments, or even voted on by the board. There was no meeting on the date Cynthia referenced in which any such vote had occurred. He checked the minutes himself while Dave was on the phone. Nothing. The claimed amendment was simply not real. Now, sending a false statement in a mass email to your entire community about a legal document that affects a neighbor's property rights is not just bad strategy. Depending on how you look at it, it's potentially defamatory. It's potentially fraudulent in the context of an HOA enforcement action, and it is definitely the kind of thing that a competent attorney will point out in a very uncomfortable setting. Tom, when I forwarded him the email, said he'd be adding it to the documentation. By the time the special meeting arrived, the situation had evolved considerably from where it started. Dave had built a calm, thorough, well-documented case that the Snowcat violation was invalid under the CCR's own emergency exception. The financial audit process had revealed at least $42,000 in HOA fund expenditures over 3 years that had no corresponding board approval, no documented purpose, and appeared to coincide with work done on Cynthia's own property, specifically a substantial renovation of her home's garage and entryway landscaping that neighbors had noticed, and which, it turned out, matched suspiciously well with the work orders that the audit uncovered. The DA investigator had been in contact with Phil and had issued a preservation notice for the financial records, and Greg's security camera footage had been formally submitted as supporting documentation for the audit. The special meeting was packed, standing room only in the clubhouse, with people spilling into the entryway and the small side room. I'd been to maybe 8 or 10 HOA meetings over the years, and the usual attendance was 8 to 15 people. This one had over 60 homeowners present. Cynthia sat at the board table at the front with the other 2 board members, Dan Withers and Susan Park, neither of whom had apparently been fully aware of the extent of what Cynthia had been doing, and both of whom had the slightly pale, worried look of people who were beginning to understand that they'd been letting something happen on their watch. Dave spoke first, clearly and without aggravation, walking through the Snowcat matter point by point. He cited the CCR. He referenced the weather emergency declaration. He specifically addressed Cynthia's claim that Section 14 had been amended and explained that this was factually incorrect and had been confirmed by ClearPath. He noted the false claim in her community email and stated that he was retaining documentation of it. He was calm and thorough and utterly unrattled, the same energy he brings to everything, and it was formidable. Several other neighbors spoke about the value of the Snowcat to the community, including the UPS driver's letter that Dave had actually received, which was a nice touch. Mrs. Patterson spoke briefly and with devastating simplicity, saying that she was 81 years old and had a heart condition, and that during the polar vortex she would not have been able to call an ambulance and receive one without Dave's work on that road, and that she was grateful, and that she believed the HOA board owed Dave an apology and a written withdrawal of the violation notice. That was when the meeting's energy shifted in a way that was impossible to miss. Cynthia tried to defend herself, but she was facing a room full of people who had read the documentation, who had seen the footage summaries Greg had shared, who had received the community email she'd sent with the false claim about the CCR amendment, and who were well past the point of deferring to her because she sounded confident. She went through her arguments about the oversized vehicle rule, and people in the room had the actual CCR document open on their phones and kept citing Section 14 back at her. She insisted the amendment had happened, and Phil Donovan, who was present at the meeting at the board's invitation, stated flatly and in front of the entire room that no such amendment appeared in any recorded document, and that he had personally reviewed every set of meeting minutes from the past 5 years. Dan Withers, to his credit, asked Cynthia directly if she had any documentation of the claimed amendment. Cynthia said she would need to locate it. Dan said he needed her to locate it before the meeting could proceed on that basis. There was a fairly long, fairly uncomfortable silence. The motion to formally dismiss the Snowcat violation notice passed by a board vote of 2-1, with Dan and Susan voting in favor of dismissal and Cynthia voting against. The motion also included a written acknowledgement, entered into the HOA minutes, that the Snowcat's use during declared weather emergencies was explicitly permitted under Section 14, Paragraph 8, and that this permission would be standing, renewable, and not subject to future challenge on dimensional grounds. Dave shook hands with Dan and Susan after the vote. He was gracious about it in a way that I found genuinely admirable. He thanked them for taking the time to review the matter properly and said he hoped the winter season would be quieter from here on out. Dan Withers looked like he wanted to apologize and wasn't quite sure how to start, and Dave made it easy for him by simply moving on, which is the kind of thing that good people do when they've won something they deserve to win. The financial matter was addressed more briefly, because it was at a stage where it couldn't be fully addressed by the board meeting alone. Phil informed the assembled homeowners that an independent audit was underway, that it had been initiated at homeowner request in accordance with their rights under the CCR and state law, and that preliminary findings had been referred to the county DA's office for review. He did not speculate about outcomes or make accusations. He simply stated the facts as they stood, professionally and carefully. But the facts as they stood were enough. You could feel the room understanding that this was not over and that it was serious. Cynthia was very quiet for that portion of the meeting. The DA investigation ran its course over the following 2 months. I don't want to jump ahead and make it sound tidier than it was, because financial investigations are grinding and slow and involve a lot of paperwork and not much drama on a day-to-day basis. But the outcome was substantive. Sandra Patel's office concluded that Cynthia Fairbanks had, over approximately 3 years, redirected approximately $47,000 in HOA funds to pay for work performed on her personal property, including the garage renovation, the landscaping, an interior paint job on her living room and entryway, and the installation of a stone pathway in her backyard. She had accomplished this by issuing HOA checks to contractors under the guise of community maintenance work, by manipulating or omitting relevant financial reporting to the board, and by creating an environment on the board in which the other members didn't feel empowered to question her decisions. She was charged with 3 counts of felony fraud and 2 counts of theft by a fiduciary. She surrendered to police at the county courthouse on a Tuesday morning in April, still the same puffy coat, still the same expression of entitled certainty, though it looked considerably less certain with 2 detectives flanking her. Her attorney entered a not guilty plea on her behalf, and she was released on bail pending trial. The trial happened in early October, and I won't go through the whole thing because you can imagine how it went when the prosecution had 14 months of security footage, a full financial audit conducted by a certified forensic accountant, documentation from the contractor who had done the garage renovation confirming that he'd been paid with a check from the Pinecrest Estates HOA Community Improvement Fund, and testimony from both Dan Withers and Susan Park, who had cooperated fully with investigators once the scope of what had been happening became clear to them. She was convicted on 2 of the 3 fraud counts and 1 of the theft counts. The judge sentenced her to 18 months of probation, a fine, and a restitution order for the full $47,000. Given that it was a first offense and the amounts, while serious, were below the threshold for mandatory incarceration, the sentence was not the most dramatic possible outcome, but the conviction was real and the restitution order was real, and the public record of what she'd done was real and permanent. The HOA held new elections that fall. Barbara Chen came back to the board. So did a retired accountant named Robert Finch, who had moved in 2 years ago and had been quietly horrified by the lack of financial transparency. Dan Withers stayed on, having gone through the experience of realizing he'd been asleep at the wheel and seemingly being genuinely changed by it. Susan Park stepped down voluntarily, saying she needed a break, which was fair. They hired a new property management oversight structure with clear path that included mandatory dual signature requirements for any expenditure over $500 and a monthly financial report distributed to all homeowners via email. Dave's Snowcat remained in his driveway, orange and patient and prepared. The first real storm of the new winter came in early December, about 20 inches in 2 days with temperatures dropping hard behind it. The roads were a disaster. The county plow came through once and then disappeared. By the second morning, half the street was compacted and icy and impassable for a regular vehicle. Dave fired up the Snowcat at 7 in the morning. I heard it start from inside my house. That particular diesel rumble that had become as comfortable and familiar as the sound of wind in the pines. And I looked out my front window and saw him rolling out of his driveway in a cloud of diesel smoke and cold air, the little blade on the front catching the gray morning light. 15 minutes later, he knocked on my door. I was already in my coat. "Coming for the run?" he asked. "Obviously," I said. We went up and down every street in Pinecrest Estates twice, pushing the snow to the sides, breaking up the ice, making it possible. Mrs. Patterson waved from her window on the first pass and had hot chocolate waiting on her porch on the second pass, which seemed optimistic given the temperature but was genuinely touching. Greg was shoveling his walk when we came by and gave us a double thumbs up. New neighbors whose names I was still learning came to their doors or windows and watched with expressions that would become very familiar, the mix of gratitude and slight wonderment that the Snowcat always generated in people who hadn't expected it. The road was clear by 10:30. The mail came through at noon. The grocery delivery van that had been waiting at the subdivision entrance for clearance pulled carefully in and made all its stops. The Pinecrest Estates HOA, for the first time in living memory, sent Dave a formal thank you letter. It was signed by Barbara Chen as the new board chair, and it specifically mentioned his years of voluntary service to the community and the value of his contribution to neighborhood safety. It was a simple thing, but it was the right thing. And when Dave showed it to me, he had the kind of expression that a man gets when something that was wrong for a long time has been made right. Not triumphant exactly, more like settled. I went home that afternoon and made myself a proper winter meal, chili on the stove with the heat turned up, and the snow piling quietly against the windows again. And I thought about how a bright orange Snowcat sitting 8 inches too tall in a driveway had ended up being the thread that, when someone mean and careless enough pulled it, had unraveled something that had needed unraveling for a long time. The community came out of it stronger and cleaner and more honest with itself than it had been before. We knew each other better. We knew our own documents better. We were paying attention now. $47,000 in restitution. Money came back into the HOA account over the following 18 months as Cynthia made her ordered payments. The new board used it to fund a real snow removal contract with a local plowing company that actually showed up during storms, and to repave the community common parking area that had been in rough shape for 3 years, and to replace the water heater in the clubhouse that had been limping along on borrowed time. They also used a portion to update the CCR document itself, making the language clearer and more explicit in ways that closed several of the ambiguities Cynthia had exploited, including adding a formal procedure for the violations committee that required co-signature from one other board member on any notice delivered to a homeowner. On the day the new parking lot paving was finished, Barbara organized a small community gathering in the clubhouse parking area. Someone brought cider, someone else brought cookies, and about 30 people showed up in the cold to stand around and admire newly paved asphalt, which sounds ridiculous but felt genuinely celebratory because it represented something more than just a parking lot. It represented the money that had been stolen from us for 3 years being returned and used properly, the community functioning the way it was supposed to function. Dave parked the Snowcat on the street in front of the parking lot for the occasion, which made several people laugh and made Barbara say it was absolutely the appropriate vehicle for the event. I stood there with a cup of warm cider and watched my neighbors talking and laughing and complaining about the cold in the comfortable way that people complain about things that they know they can handle. And I thought about how much of this might not have happened without a ridiculous argument about an 8-inch height difference during a polar vortex. Sometimes the right fight comes along disguised as a petty one. Sometimes the smallest seeming confrontation turns out to be the one that needed to happen. Cynthia sold her house the following spring and moved to a condo development across the county, where presumably someone else's HOA would have the pleasure of her company. I don't know what happened after that, and I can't honestly say I lost sleep wondering. Dave's garage, which he'd been meaning to clean out and organize for 2 years, finally got sorted out over the winter and spring, and the Snowcat moved in there with plenty of room on either side, maintained and covered and ready for the next February that needed it. He told me he'd been thinking about getting it repainted but decided against it. The orange was fine. The orange was right. You could see it from 3 houses away on the darkest, snowiest morning, and it looked exactly like what it was. A useful thing in the hands of a good person, fully prepared to do what needed doing. That's the story start to finish. $47,000, a few bad winters, one excellent piece of tract equipment, and a neighborhood that came out the other side knowing itself a little better and trusting itself a little more. Cynthia Fairbanks had the authority she had because people let her have it without paying attention. The moment people started paying attention, she didn't have very much at all. Pay attention to your HOA documents is what I'd tell anyone. Read the whole thing, not just the section that's being used against you. Keep records. Know your rights. And if you happen to have a neighbor with a Snowcat and a good heart, you are doing better than you might realize.